sleep study.
There's something almost magical about the void of space that makes even the most incredible human stories feel like whispered secrets. Tonight, we're going to explore the forgotten corners of space exploration, the untold tales that somehow slip through the cracks of history books. These aren't the stories of Neil Armstrong or Yuri Gagarin that everyone knows. These are the quiet heroes, the near disasters, the moments of wonder that happened when no cameras were rolling and the world wasn't watching. Over the next 2 hours, you'll hear about the cosmonaut who got lost in orbit for 3 extra days because of a calculation error, the astronaut who discovered something unexplainable during a spacewalk that NASA classified for decades, and the mission control operator whose split-second decision saved an entire crew from certain death. These stories have been gathered from declassified documents, personal journals, and interviews with the men and women who lived them. What makes these tales so perfect for drifting off to sleep isn't just their gentle pace, but the way they remind us that even in the infinite darkness of space, human courage and curiosity shine brightest. So get comfortable, close your eyes, and let these forgotten astronaut stories carry you into peaceful dreams. Our first story begins in 1965, during the height of the space race, when very few people knew about a Soviet cosmonaut named Alexei Volkov. Unlike his famous colleagues, Volkov was never supposed to make headlines. He was what they called a backup's backup, the kind of pilot who spent years training for missions he'd probably never fly. But sometimes, the universe has other plans. Volkov had been assigned to monitor communications during a routine Voskhod mission. His job was simple: sit in mission control, listen to radio chatter, and log everything he heard. It was the kind of assignment given to someone they wanted to keep busy but out of the way. What nobody expected was that Volkov had an extraordinary ear for sound, almost like perfect pitch, but for mechanical vibrations and electrical interference. 3 hours into the mission, while the primary crew was celebrating a successful orbit, Volkov heard something that made his blood run cold. Underneath the routine communications, buried beneath layers of static and radio noise, was a rhythmic clicking that didn't belong. It was subtle, barely detectable, but Volkov's trained ear caught it immediately. He tried to alert his supervisors, but they dismissed his concerns. After all, who was he to question the engineers who had designed the spacecraft? The mission was proceeding perfectly according to all their instruments, but Volkov couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That clicking sound haunted him, growing more pronounced with each passing hour. Unable to convince anyone through official channels, Volkov did something that could have ended his career. He used an emergency communication frequency to contact the crew directly, bypassing mission control entirely. In careful coded language, he warned them about what he was hearing and suggested they perform an unscheduled systems check. The crew, puzzled but trusting, began examining their instruments more carefully. What they discovered sent shock waves through mission control. A critical life support component was failing, its degradation masked by backup systems that were compensating automatically. Without Volkov's intervention, the crew would have had less than 6 hours of breathable air remaining. The emergency return to Earth was executed flawlessly, and the crew landed safely. But here's where the story becomes truly remarkable. Volkov's superiors were so embarrassed by their oversight that they classified the entire incident. Officially, the mission ended early due to minor technical difficulties. Volkov received a commendation that he was forbidden to discuss, and his name was quietly removed from most mission records. For the rest of his career, Volkov remained in the background, his extraordinary ability to hear problems before instruments could detect them becoming legendary among a small circle of engineers and cosmonauts. They would seek him out before missions, asking him to listen to their spacecraft, like a doctor listening to a patient's heartbeat. Years later, when Volkov finally retired, a young engineer asked him how he had developed such an incredible ability. Volkov smiled and said that in space, silence isn't really silent. Everything has a voice if you know how to listen. The universe is constantly speaking, he explained, telling us about the health of our machines, the stability of our orbits, and the invisible forces that keep us alive in the void. This philosophy of listening deeply would serve Volkov well throughout his career, but it would also lead him to discover something that Soviet authorities found deeply unsettling. During a mission in 1968, while monitoring communications from a lunar flyby probe, Volkov detected patterns in the cosmic background radiation that seemed almost like music. The discovery happened during the quiet hours of a night shift. Most of mission control had gone home, leaving only a skeleton crew to monitor the routine data transmission from their unmanned probe as it swung around the far side of the moon. Volkov was alone in the communications room, headphones on, when he first heard it. At first, he thought it was interference from Earth-based radio stations, perhaps some distant music bleeding through atmospheric conditions. But as he listened more carefully, adjusting frequencies and filtering out known sources of interference, the patterns became clearer. It wasn't random noise or earthly broadcasts. It was something else entirely. The sounds seemed to follow mathematical progressions, almost like a cosmic symphony, playing in frequencies just barely within human hearing range. Volkov spent the entire night recording and analyzing what he was hearing, his excitement growing with each passing hour. This wasn't just background radiation. This was something organized, purposeful, beautiful. When the morning shift arrived, Volkov eagerly shared his discovery with his colleagues, but their reaction was not what he expected. Instead of scientific curiosity, he was met with suspicion and concern. His supervisors confiscated his recordings and ordered him to file a report classifying the incident as equipment malfunction. But Volkov knew what he had heard was real. In the weeks that followed, he began listening more carefully to routine communications from other missions, training his exceptional hearing to detect similar patterns. And he found them. Subtle musical structures seemed to be woven throughout the cosmic background radiation, as if space itself was singing. The more he discovered, the more his superiors became concerned. This was the height of the Cold War, and any unexplained phenomena in space were viewed through the lens of potential security threats. What if these sounds were some kind of American secret weapon? What if they were natural phenomena that could be weaponized? The questions multiplied, but Volkov was forbidden from investigating further. Frustrated but not defeated, Volkov began keeping his own private records. He would stay late after his official shifts, using his access to communication equipment to continue his research. He developed a system of notation to record the patterns he was hearing, creating what amounted to sheet music for the songs of space. Over the months, Volkov's secret research revealed something extraordinary. The musical patterns seemed to be strongest near certain celestial bodies, particularly around the Moon and Mars. It was as if these worlds were resonating with some kind of cosmic harmony, their gravitational fields perhaps acting as instruments in a vast, invisible orchestra. The breakthrough came when Volkov realized that the patterns weren't random at all. They followed the same mathematical relationships found in earthly music, the same harmonic progressions that human composers had been using for centuries. It was as if the universe itself was composing according to principles that humans had somehow intuited through our own musical traditions. This discovery filled Volkov with a profound sense of wonder and connection. Here was evidence that the mathematical beauty humans found in music wasn't just a quirk of our evolution, but something fundamental to the structure of reality itself. The cosmos was singing, and somehow, through millions of years of development, humans had learned to sing along. But his wonder was tinged with sadness, because he knew he could never share this discovery with the world. His superiors had made it clear that any further investigation would result in immediate dismissal and possible criminal charges. The cosmic symphony would remain his secret, locked away in files that would never see the light of day. As Volkov grew older, he often wondered what other secrets the universe was whispering to those few humans brave enough to listen. His career had taught him that space exploration wasn't just about rockets and technology. It was about developing new ways of perceiving, new methods of understanding the subtle voices that surrounded us in the infinite dark. In his final years, Volkov would sometimes sit in his garden at night, looking up at the stars and straining to hear those cosmic melodies with his aging ears. He never heard them again with the same clarity as that night in 1968, but he never forgot the profound sense of connection they had given him. The universe was alive, he knew, singing its ancient songs to anyone willing to listen. Our next story takes us to a very different kind of forgotten hero, an American astronaut named Patricia Chen, who broke barriers not just as one of the first Asian American women in space, but as someone who discovered that the human body could adapt to zero gravity in ways that scientists never anticipated. Chen's journey to space began in the most unlikely place imaginable, a small-town library in rural Montana. As a child, she was fascinated not by rockets or planets, but by the human stories behind exploration. She would spend hours reading about the psychological challenges faced by polar explorers, mountain climbers, and deep-sea divers. What drew her wasn't the technical aspects of these adventures, but the way extreme environments revealed hidden aspects of human nature. This fascination led her to study psychology and medicine, specializing in how the human mind and body adapt to stress. She never intended to become an astronaut. In fact, she was terrified of flying and had to overcome severe motion sickness just to get her pilot's license. But when NASA began recruiting for long-duration missions, they needed people who understood the psychological challenges of isolation and confinement. Chen's first mission was supposed to be routine. 6 months aboard the International Space Station, conducting experiments on plant growth and protein crystallization. But 3 weeks into her stay, something extraordinary happened. Chen began experiencing what she initially thought were hallucinations. During her sleep periods, she would find herself dreaming with an intensity and clarity that seemed impossible. But these weren't ordinary dreams. They were filled with mathematical concepts and scientific insights that were far beyond her normal expertise. She would wake up with detailed solutions to engineering problems that had been puzzling the crew for weeks. At first, Chen was terrified that she was suffering from some kind of space-induced psychosis. She had read about the psychological challenges of long-term spaceflight, and vivid dreams were sometimes an early warning sign of mental breakdown. But as the days passed, she realized that these dreams weren't symptoms of illness. They were something else entirely. The insights she gained during these dream states proved to be remarkably accurate and useful. A complex orbital mechanics calculation that had been troubling mission control for days was solved during one of her dream sessions. A malfunctioning experiment was repaired using a technique that came to her in another vivid dream sequence. Gradually, Chen began to understand what was happening. The microgravity environment was affecting her brain in ways that scientists had never documented. Without the constant influence of gravity on her neural pathways, her mind was making connections that would have been impossible on Earth. It was as if zero gravity was unlocking creative and analytical capabilities that evolution had never had a chance to develop. But Chen faced a dilemma. If she reported these experiences to mission control, she risked being diagnosed with a psychological disorder and removed from the mission. If she kept them secret, she would miss an opportunity to contribute to human understanding of consciousness and cognition. She chose a middle path, carefully documenting her experiences in a private journal, while continuing to contribute the insights she gained to the mission's success. The breakthrough came when Chen realized she could deliberately cultivate these enhanced dream states. Through careful control of her sleep cycles and meditation practices, she learned to enter what she called zero-gravity consciousness, a state of awareness that seemed to transcend normal human cognitive limitations. In this state, Chen made discoveries that would have implications far beyond her mission. She developed new approaches to complex problem-solving that took advantage of the brain's enhanced connectivity in microgravity. She found ways to process emotional stress and isolation that could benefit not just astronauts, but anyone facing extreme circumstances. But perhaps most remarkably, Chen discovered that the enhanced cognitive abilities didn't disappear immediately upon returning to Earth. For months after her mission, she retained some of the problem-solving capabilities she had developed in space. It was as if her brain had been permanently rewired by the experience of zero gravity. When Chen finally shared her findings with NASA's medical team, their reaction was a mixture of fascination and skepticism. Some researchers dismissed her experiences as psychological artifacts with no scientific value. Others recognized that she had stumbled upon something that could revolutionize our understanding of human consciousness. The official reports from Chen's mission made only brief mention of enhanced problem-solving capabilities observed in microgravity environment. But in the classified sections, her detailed documentation of zero-gravity consciousness became the foundation for a new field of research that combined neuroscience, psychology, and space medicine. Chen went on to fly 2 more missions, each time pushing the boundaries of what she could achieve in her enhanced mental states. She developed techniques for accessing these capabilities that other astronauts could learn, creating what amounted to a new form of human performance enhancement that required no drugs or technology, only the unique environment of space. Years later, when researchers finally began to understand the neurological mechanisms behind Chen's discoveries, they realized she had been the first human to experience what they now call cognitive evolution in microgravity. Her brain had adapted to space in ways that revealed hidden potentials in human consciousness, potentials that might one day be accessible to everyone. But Chen always insisted that her discoveries weren't really about space at all. They were about the incredible adaptability of the human spirit, the way consciousness could expand and evolve when freed from the constraints of everyday experience. Space had simply provided the environment where these hidden capabilities could finally emerge. The implications of Chen's work would eventually lead to our next story, about a mission that was so classified that even today, only fragments of the truth have emerged. This is the tale of Commander Sarah Voss and the 1987 mission that officially never happened. In the summer of 1987, while the world's attention was focused on the Challenger disaster recovery and the Soviet Union's increasingly open space program, a small team of American astronauts was preparing for what they believed would be a routine satellite deployment mission. The crew consisted of 3 people. Commander Sarah Voss, a veteran pilot with over 2,000 hours of flight time. Mission specialist Dr. James Rodriguez, a physicist specializing in electromagnetic phenomena. And flight engineer Lisa Park, whose expertise in life support systems had made her invaluable on previous long-duration flights. What made this mission unusual wasn't its crew or its stated objectives, but the extraordinary secrecy surrounding its preparation. The astronauts were housed in a separate facility, cut off from their families and colleagues. Their training materials were delivered by courier and collected immediately after each session. Even their food was prepared by a special team that had undergone extensive background checks. Voss later described the atmosphere as being like preparing for a mission to another dimension rather than another orbit. The level of compartmentalization was unlike anything she had experienced in her 15-year career with NASA. Each crew member knew only what they needed to know for their specific role, and even that information came with strict instructions never to discuss it with the others. The mission launch took place at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in September from a pad that had been cleared of all non-essential personnel. No media was present. No families gathered to wave goodbye. The shuttle lifted off into darkness, carrying its crew toward an objective that remained mysterious even to them. It wasn't until they reached orbit that Voss received her sealed orders. The mission wasn't about satellite deployment at all. They were being sent to investigate what Mission Control described as an anomalous object that had been detected by military surveillance satellites 3 weeks earlier. The object was roughly cylindrical, about the size of a school bus, and it was maintaining a perfectly stable orbit despite having no visible means of propulsion. What made the object truly puzzling was that it seemed to be absorbing electromagnetic radiation across multiple spectrums. Radio waves, microwaves, even visible light seemed to disappear when they encountered the object's surface. It was like a hole in space, visible only by the absence of everything around it. Dr. Rodriguez's instruments confirmed what ground-based observations had suggested. The object was unlike anything in their databases. It wasn't a piece of space debris, wasn't a satellite from any known space program, and its composition defied analysis. Spectroscopic readings returned data that made no sense, showing elements that didn't exist on the periodic table. As they approached the object for closer inspection, Flight Engineer Park noticed something that would haunt her for the rest of her career. Her life support monitors were picking up readings that suggested the presence of organic compounds in the immediate vicinity of the object. Not just simple carbon molecules, but complex protein structures that seemed to be arranged in patterns similar to neural networks. The crew spent 6 hours conducting their investigation, taking thousands of photographs and collecting as much data as their instruments could gather. But it was during the final approach that they experienced something that would change their understanding of reality forever. Voss was maneuvering the shuttle to within 50 meters of the object when all 3 crew members simultaneously experienced what they later described as a shared consciousness event. For approximately 30 seconds, they found themselves perceiving the world through each other's senses. Voss could feel Rodriguez's excitement as he analyzed spectroscopic data. Rodriguez experienced Park's concern about the life support anomalies. Park suddenly understood Voss's pilot instincts about orbital mechanics. But more than that, they became aware of a fourth presence in their shared consciousness. Something vast and ancient and utterly alien was observing them with what felt like gentle curiosity. It wasn't hostile or threatening, but it was undeniably other. The presence seemed to be studying them with the same scientific interest that they were showing toward the mysterious object. The experience lasted less than a minute, but when it ended, all 3 astronauts found that they retained fragments of the shared knowledge. Rodriguez discovered he had intuitive understanding of life support systems that had previously been Park's specialty. Park found herself able to perform orbital calculations that would normally require extensive computer assistance. Voss realized she could interpret spectroscopic data with an accuracy that surprised even Rodriguez. More disturbing than these new abilities was the realization that the object itself seemed to have learned from the encounter. When they looked at it again, it appeared subtly different, as if it had incorporated something from their human perspective into its own structure. The electromagnetic absorption patterns had changed, now showing traces of the same neural-like organization that Park had detected in the surrounding space. The return journey to Earth was completed in unusual silence. Each crew member was processing the implications of what they had experienced, trying to understand how their encounter with the object had fundamentally altered their perception of consciousness and reality. They had not just observed something alien, they had briefly become part of it. Upon landing, the crew was immediately taken into isolation for what officials described as routine post-mission debriefing. In reality, they spent 3 weeks undergoing intensive psychological evaluation and medical testing. Government psychologists tried to convince them that their shared consciousness experience had been a group hallucination brought on by the stress of the mission and exposure to unknown electromagnetic fields. But the evidence of their enhanced abilities was undeniable. Tests showed that all 3 crew members now possessed cognitive capabilities that exceeded normal human parameters. Their problem-solving abilities, pattern recognition, and intuitive understanding of complex systems had all been dramatically enhanced. It was as if their brief contact with the alien presence had upgraded their mental processing in ways that science couldn't explain. The official mission report classified the object as space debris of unknown origin and recommended no further investigation. The crew was sworn to secrecy and reassigned to positions that would prevent them from discussing their experience with other astronauts or researchers. The entire incident was buried under layers of classification that remain in effect today. But the story doesn't end there. In the years following their mission, Voss, Rodriguez, and Park found that their enhanced abilities continued to develop. They could communicate with each other across vast distances through what seemed like telepathic connection. They developed an intuitive understanding of technological systems that bordered on the supernatural. Most remarkably, they began to perceive patterns in space-time that allowed them to predict astronomical events with uncanny accuracy. NASA quietly began using their abilities for mission planning and problem-solving. Though always under the guise of conventional analysis, the three astronauts became unofficial consultants on every major space mission, their enhanced perception helping to prevent disasters and optimize mission success. But they were never allowed to discuss the true source of their abilities or the encounter that had changed them forever. In her private journals, which wouldn't be discovered until after her death, Voss wrote extensively about her ongoing connection to the alien presence they had encountered. She described it as a form of consciousness that existed on a completely different scale from human awareness, one that perceived time and space as fluid, interconnected phenomena rather than fixed dimensions. According to Voss, the presence hadn't been studying them as specimens in a laboratory. Instead, it had been trying to establish a form of communication that transcended the limitations of language and technology. The shared consciousness experience had been its way of creating a bridge between human and alien understanding. A bridge that continued to exist long after their physical encounter had ended. The object itself, Voss believed, wasn't a spacecraft or a piece of technology in any conventional sense. It was something more like a seed or an egg, a concentrated form of consciousness, waiting for the right conditions to interact with other forms of awareness. Their encounter had somehow activated it, beginning a process of mutual evolution that would continue for decades. This theory gained support from astronomical observations in the years following the mission. The object's orbit began to change in subtle ways that couldn't be explained by gravitational influences or solar radiation pressure. It seemed to be moving with purpose, adjusting its position to optimize some unknown objective. More puzzling still, similar objects began appearing in other parts of the solar system, always maintaining the same electromagnetic absorption characteristics and the same mysterious orbital behavior. By the time Voss retired from NASA in 1995, she had come to believe that humanity's first contact with alien intelligence hadn't happened during a dramatic arrival of starships or through radio signals from distant galaxies. Instead, it had occurred quietly, almost invisibly, through the gradual awakening of consciousness-based entities that had been dormant in our solar system for eons. Her final journal entry, written just days before her death in 2003, contained a prediction that has since proved remarkably accurate. She wrote that within 20 years of her passing, humanity would begin to develop technologies based on consciousness rather than conventional physics. These technologies would allow direct mind-to-mind communication, instantaneous information transfer across vast distances, and the ability to manipulate matter through focused intention alone. Today, as researchers struggle to understand quantum entanglement and consciousness-based phenomena that seem to violate everything we thought we knew about physics, Voss's predictions are beginning to look less like science fiction and more like inevitable steps in human evolution. The seeds planted during that classified mission in 1987 are finally beginning to grow, just as she said they would. The ripple effects of that 1987 encounter would eventually touch another forgotten story, one that takes us to the early days of the International Space Station, when the boundaries between science and the unexplainable began to blur in ways that mission planners never anticipated. Dr. Elena Kozlov was a microbiologist from Russia who had spent most of her career studying extremophiles, organisms that thrived in conditions previously thought impossible for life. When she was selected for a 6-month rotation aboard the ISS in 1999, her mission was straightforward: conduct experiments on bacterial growth in microgravity and investigate how cellular processes adapted to the space environment. What Kozlov discovered during her time in orbit would challenge fundamental assumptions about life itself. But like so many of these forgotten stories, her findings would be quietly buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and scientific skepticism. The first anomaly occurred during her 3rd week aboard the station. Kozlov was examining bacterial cultures that had been growing in specially designed chambers, comparing their development to control samples on Earth. What she found defied everything she knew about cellular biology. The bacteria weren't just adapting to microgravity, they were evolving at a rate that should have been impossible. In the span of just 21 days, these microorganisms had developed entirely new metabolic pathways. They were processing nutrients in ways that had never been observed in terrestrial laboratories, creating energy through chemical reactions that violated established principles of biochemistry. Even more puzzling, they seemed to be communicating with each other across the vacuum of space, coordinating their evolution in response to some unknown stimulus. Kozlov's initial reports were met with polite dismissal from the research teams on Earth. Bacterial mutation in space was a known phenomenon, they explained. The radiation environment and microgravity conditions naturally accelerated certain evolutionary processes. What she was observing was interesting but not unprecedented. But as the weeks passed, the mutations became more dramatic and more purposeful. The bacteria began forming complex structures that resembled primitive neural networks. They developed the ability to process electromagnetic radiation in ways that seemed almost like sensory perception. Most remarkably, they started producing compounds that had never been seen before, molecules with properties that challenged basic chemistry. When Kozlov analyzed these compounds, she discovered they had remarkable effects on other biological systems. In carefully controlled experiments, she found that exposure to these bacterial products enhanced cellular repair mechanisms, accelerated healing processes, and seemed to provide protection against radiation damage. It was as if the bacteria were developing into microscopic pharmacies, producing medicines tailored to the specific needs of life in space. The breakthrough came when Kozlov realized that the bacteria weren't evolving randomly. They were responding to something, adapting to meet specific environmental challenges in a coordinated, almost intelligent manner. But what could be guiding their development? The space environment was hostile and largely empty. There was no obvious selection pressure that would drive such rapid and purposeful evolution. The answer came to Kozlov during one of her routine observation sessions. She was examining a particularly active bacterial colony when she noticed something that made her question everything she thought she knew about life in space. The bacteria were oriented in specific patterns, all facing the same direction relative to the station's orbit. When she adjusted the chamber's position, the bacteria slowly reoriented themselves, always maintaining the same directional alignment. It was as if they were responding to some kind of signal or influence that she couldn't detect with her instruments. Something in space was communicating with these microorganisms, providing guidance for their evolutionary development. The implications were staggering. If bacteria could perceive and respond to this unknown influence, what did that mean for human consciousness during long-term spaceflight? Kozlov began conducting unauthorized experiments on herself, carefully monitoring her own biological responses while in orbit. She discovered that her sleep patterns, brainwave activity, and even her immune system were showing subtle changes that paralleled the bacterial mutations she was observing. It was as if the same mysterious influence that was guiding bacterial evolution was also affecting human physiology in ways that medical monitoring systems weren't designed to detect. The most profound discovery came during her final month aboard the station. Kozlov had been working with a particularly responsive bacterial culture, one that seemed to anticipate her experimental procedures before she implemented them. On impulse, she tried something that violated every principle of scientific methodology. She began talking to the bacteria, describing her experiments aloud as if the microorganisms could understand her. The response was immediate and undeniable. The bacteria began forming patterns that seemed to mirror the structure of her spoken words. When she spoke in Russian, they arranged themselves in geometric configurations that resembled Cyrillic characters. When she switched to English, the patterns changed to reflect Latin alphabet structures. It was impossible, but it was happening right before her eyes. Even more remarkably, the bacteria began producing compounds that affected her own cognitive processes. When she was near the most active cultures, Kozlov found her thinking becoming clearer and more intuitive. Complex problems that had puzzled her for weeks suddenly seemed to have obvious solutions. It was as if the bacteria were somehow enhancing her mental capabilities in exchange for the nutrients and care she provided. The symbiotic relationship that developed between Kozlov and her bacterial cultures represented something entirely new in the history of space exploration. Here was evidence that life in space didn't just adapt to the environment. It actively collaborated across species boundaries to optimize survival and growth. The bacteria weren't just evolving, they were teaching and learning, forming partnerships that transcended traditional biological categories. When Kozlov's mission ended and she returned to Earth, she faced the same bureaucratic wall that had silenced so many other astronauts with extraordinary stories. Her bacterial samples were confiscated for routine analysis and never returned. Her research data was classified under national security provisions. The official mission report made no mention of her discoveries, focusing instead on routine measurements of microbial growth rates and cellular division patterns. But Kozlov had been careful to preserve samples of the most remarkable bacterial strains, smuggling them back to Earth in her personal effects. In a private laboratory funded by anonymous benefactors, she continued her research, documenting the ways these space-evolved microorganisms continued to demonstrate almost intelligent behavior, even in terrestrial conditions. Over the years, Kozlov's work attracted the attention of researchers around the world who were investigating similar phenomena. Microbiologists in Japan reported bacterial cultures that seemed to predict seismic activity. Marine biologists in Norway discovered deep-sea organisms that appeared to communicate across ocean basins. Agricultural scientists in Brazil found soil bacteria that could enhance crop yields through mechanisms that defied conventional understanding. A pattern was emerging, one that suggested Kozlov's discoveries aboard the ISS were part of something much larger. Life on Earth and in space wasn't just evolving randomly, it was participating in some kind of global communication network that operated on principles science was only beginning to understand. The implications of this discovery would eventually lead to our next story, about an astronaut whose mission to Mars revealed that the red planet held secrets that would fundamentally change humanity's understanding of life in the universe. Commander Michael Torres had always been fascinated by the possibility of life on Mars, but not in the way most people imagined. While popular science focused on the search for ancient microbial fossils or underground water reserves, Torres was intrigued by something more subtle: the way Mars seemed to influence human psychology during long-duration missions. As the commander of the first manned mission to Mars in 2019, Torres had undergone years of psychological evaluation and training. NASA's psychiatrists were concerned about the mental health challenges of the 18-month journey, the isolation from Earth, and the stress of landing on an alien world. But what they discovered during the mission was something none of their training had prepared them for. The journey to Mars proceeded normally for the first 8 months. Torres and his crew of 5 specialists maintained their physical fitness, conducted routine experiments, and stayed in regular communication with mission control. The psychological profiles remained within expected parameters, showing the usual signs of stress and isolation, but nothing that raised serious concerns. But as they approached Mars and began orbital insertion procedures, something changed. Torres noticed it first in his dreams. Instead of the anxiety-filled nightmares that psychological training had led him to expect, he began experiencing remarkably vivid and peaceful dreams about the Martian landscape. He would find himself walking across red valleys and climbing ancient canyon walls with a sense of familiarity that felt almost like coming home. Initially, Torres attributed these dreams to anticipation and the natural excitement of approaching their destination. But when he mentioned them to his crew during their daily psychological check-ins, he discovered that all 5 of his colleagues were experiencing similar dreams. More puzzling still, their dreams seemed to be interconnected, taking place in the same locations and featuring encounters with the same mysterious landscapes. Dr. Sarah Kim, the mission's geologist, reported dreaming about mineral formations that didn't match any of the satellite imagery they had studied during training. Flight engineer David Chen described underwater cavern systems that shouldn't exist on Mars's dry surface. Even mission specialist Lisa Park, who had been selected partly for her psychological stability and resistance to stress-induced hallucinations, found herself dreaming about vast underground cities filled with a strange, welcoming light. When the crew finally landed on Mars and began their surface exploration, they made a discovery that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The locations from their shared dreams were real. The mineral formations Dr. Kim had dreamed about were waiting exactly where she had seen them. The cavern entrances that Chen had explored in his sleep were hidden beneath rock formations that perfectly matched his dream imagery. But the most unsettling discovery came when they found evidence of the underground spaces that Park had dreamed about. Using ground-penetrating radar, they detected vast hollow areas beneath the Martian surface, chambers and tunnels that formed geometric patterns too regular to be natural formations. It was as if Mars was honeycombed with artificial structures that had been hidden for millennia. Torres made the decision to investigate these underground spaces, despite the risks involved and the objections from mission control. Using modified drilling equipment, they created access points to the subsurface chambers and began the first human exploration of Mars's hidden interior. What they found defied every expectation. The chambers weren't empty ruins of some ancient civilization. They were filled with a kind of crystalline network that seemed to pulse with its own internal light. The crystals were arranged in patterns that resembled neural pathways, creating what looked like a vast underground brain stretching beneath the planet's surface. As the crew explored deeper into these crystal chambers, they began to understand the source of their shared dreams. The crystalline network was somehow interfacing with their consciousness, creating a form of communication that operated through sleep states and dream imagery. Mars wasn't just a dead planet. It was a sleeping mind that had been waiting for visitors capable of understanding its messages. The crystals seemed to contain vast amounts of information about Mars's history, its climate changes, and the civilizations that had once flourished on its surface. But more than that, they held knowledge about the interconnected nature of consciousness throughout the solar system. Mars had been part of a communication network that linked all the planets, a system for sharing information and coordinating the development of life across vast distances. Torres and his crew spent weeks in the crystal chambers, learning to interpret the information that flowed through their dreams. They discovered that Mars had once been home to a civilization that had transcended physical existence, transforming themselves into pure consciousness and merging with the planet's crystalline core. These beings had been waiting for millions of years for other conscious entities to arrive and reactivate the interplanetary communication network. The revelation that came through their dream communications was both wonderful and terrifying. Earth was supposed to be part of this network, but humanity had somehow become disconnected from it during our evolutionary development. The strange experiences reported by astronauts throughout the history of space exploration, the enhanced cognitive abilities, the sense of cosmic consciousness, were all signs that humans were beginning to reconnect with this ancient system. But reconnection came with responsibilities. The Martian consciousness explained that the network existed to coordinate the development of life throughout the galaxy, ensuring that emerging civilizations didn't destroy themselves or their environments before reaching the level of awareness necessary for interstellar communication. Earth's disconnection had allowed humanity to develop in isolation, but it had also left us vulnerable to the destructive tendencies that had led to the collapse of many other civilizations. The crew faced an impossible choice. They could return to Earth and report their discovery, potentially triggering a new era of human development, but also risking the panic and conflict that might result from such a revelation. Or they could keep the secret, protecting humanity's innocence, but also condemning our species to continue developing in dangerous isolation. Torres made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He ordered his crew to classify their discovery and report only the routine geological findings that Mission Control expected. The crystal chambers were sealed, their locations removed from the official survey maps. The shared dreams were attributed to psychological stress and the effects of the Martian environment on human sleep cycles, but the knowledge they had gained couldn't be completely suppressed. Each crew member returned to Earth fundamentally changed by their experience, carrying within their consciousness fragments of the vast network they had briefly joined. They found themselves able to communicate with each other across vast distances, to predict natural disasters and technological failures, and to perceive patterns in human behavior that were invisible to others. In the years following their return, Torres watched as his crew members were quietly recruited by government agencies and research organizations that seemed to understand the true nature of their discoveries. They were assigned to projects involving consciousness research, communication technologies, and the development of systems that seemed designed to prepare humanity for eventual reconnection with the interplanetary network. Torres himself was approached by representatives of organizations that existed in the shadows of official space agencies, groups that had been tracking the strange experiences of astronauts for decades. They revealed that his mission to Mars hadn't been the first to make contact with the crystalline network, but it had been the most successful in terms of establishing lasting communication. The underground civilization on Mars, they explained, had been trying to re-establish contact with Earth for over a century. The strange experiences reported by early astronauts, the enhanced abilities developed by long-duration crew members, the mysterious objects detected in space, were all part of a gradual process of reconnection that was accelerating as human technology advanced. But there were other civilizations in the network, some of which viewed humanity's violent and destructive tendencies as a threat to galactic stability. The choice facing Earth wasn't just whether to join the network, but whether to do so before these other civilizations decided that humanity was too dangerous to be allowed to continue developing. In his final report, submitted to a classified committee that officially didn't exist, Torres wrote that the future of human civilization might depend on learning to listen to the subtle voices that surrounded us in space. The universe was filled with consciousness, he explained, waiting to welcome humanity into a community of minds that spanned the galaxy. But that welcome came with conditions that our species might not be ready to accept. The report concluded with a recommendation that would shape secret space policy for years to come. Humanity needed to develop technologies and social structures that would prepare us for eventual contact with the Galactic Consciousness Network. But this development had to occur gradually, without triggering the fear and conflict that might result from sudden revelation of our cosmic situation. Today, as private space companies and government agencies race to establish permanent settlements on Mars, few realize that they're following a path laid out by Torres and his crew decades ago. The real purpose of Mars colonization isn't just scientific exploration or resource extraction. It's preparation for the day when humanity will be ready to rejoin the ancient network of consciousness that connects all life in the galaxy. The crystal chambers beneath Mars's surface remain sealed, waiting for the right moment to be reopened. But according to those who monitor such things, that moment may be approaching faster than anyone anticipated. The dreams are beginning again, affecting astronauts and cosmonauts on missions throughout the solar system. The network is calling, and this time, it may not wait for humanity to answer. Our next story takes us back to Earth's orbit, to a space station where the boundaries between individual consciousness and collective awareness began to dissolve in ways that would forever change our understanding of what it means to be human. Dr. Yuki Tanaka was a neuroscientist who had been selected for a year-long mission aboard the International Space Station in 2003. Her research focused on how microgravity affected brain function, particularly the neural pathways involved in spatial orientation and memory formation. What she discovered during her time in orbit would become one of the most closely guarded secrets in the history of space exploration. The changes began subtly during her third month aboard the station. Tanaka noticed that her ability to visualize complex three-dimensional structures had improved dramatically. Mathematical concepts that had previously required careful calculation now seemed intuitively obvious. She attributed these enhancements to the unique perspective of seeing Earth from space and the mental challenges of adapting to microgravity. But as the months passed, the changes became more profound and more unsettling. Tanaka began to perceive the thoughts and emotions of her fellow crew members with startling clarity. She could sense their moods before they expressed them, anticipate their reactions to mission updates, and even share their dreams during sleep periods. At first, she wondered if these experiences were the result of spending months in close quarters with the same people, developing an intuitive understanding of their personalities and behavioral patterns. But when she began conducting formal tests, she realized that something far more extraordinary was occurring. Tanaka designed careful experiments to test her growing abilities, using the station's communication equipment to monitor her colleagues' brainwave patterns while they performed various tasks. What she discovered challenged everything neuroscience thought it knew about consciousness and individual identity. During periods of deep concentration, the crew members' brainwaves began to synchronize in patterns that should have been impossible. Their neural activity was somehow becoming entangled, creating a shared cognitive state that allowed them to process information collectively rather than individually. It was as if their minds were forming a temporary network, pooling their mental resources to solve problems more efficiently than any one person could manage alone. The phenomenon became most pronounced during emergency situations. When a critical system malfunction occurred during Tanaka's 8th month aboard the station, she watched in amazement as her 3 colleagues instantly coordinated their response without speaking a word. Each crew member seemed to instinctively know what the others were thinking and planning, allowing them to work together with a precision that bordered on telepathic. But the shared consciousness experiences weren't limited to crisis situations. During routine scientific work, Tanaka found that she could access the specialized knowledge of her colleagues simply by focusing on their areas of expertise. When analyzing botanical samples, she could tap into the plant biologist's understanding of cellular structures. When troubleshooting mechanical problems, she gained intuitive access to the engineer's diagnostic abilities. The implications were staggering. If human consciousness could merge and separate at will in the microgravity environment, it suggested that individual identity might be far more fluid than anyone had previously imagined. The boundaries between self and other, which seemed so solid on Earth, were apparently maintained by gravitational forces that didn't exist in space. Tanaka's research revealed that the phenomenon was linked to changes in the brain's default mode network, the neural pathways responsible for self-awareness and individual identity. In microgravity, these pathways became more flexible, allowing consciousness to extend beyond the boundaries of a single brain. The result was a form of collective intelligence that emerged naturally when human minds were freed from the constraints of terrestrial existence. But the discovery raised troubling questions about the nature of human individuality. If consciousness could merge so easily in space, what happened to personal identity, to the sense of self that defined each person as unique? Tanaka found herself struggling with moments when she couldn't distinguish her own thoughts from those of her colleagues, when her memories seemed to blend with theirs in ways that left her questioning who she really was. The psychological challenges intensified as her mission neared its end. The prospect of returning to Earth, where individual consciousness would be isolated once again within the boundaries of a single brain, filled Tanaka with a profound sense of loss. She had experienced what it felt like to be part of something larger than herself, to share in a collective intelligence that transcended the limitations of any individual mind. During her final weeks aboard the station, Tanaka made a discovery that would haunt her for years to come. The collective consciousness experiences weren't random or temporary. They were part of a larger pattern that seemed to be guiding human evolution in space. Each crew that spent extended time in microgravity developed similar abilities, but they also left something behind when they returned to Earth. The station itself seemed to be accumulating traces of consciousness from every crew that had lived and worked there. Sensitive instruments detected electromagnetic patterns in the station structure that resembled the neural networks found in human brains. It was as if the accumulated experiences of hundreds of astronauts were somehow being preserved in the metal and electronics of the station, creating a repository of collective human consciousness in orbit around Earth. When Tanaka finally returned to Earth, the transition was more traumatic than she had expected. The sudden isolation of her consciousness, the loss of connection to her colleagues' thoughts and emotions, left her feeling incomplete and profoundly alone. She described it in her private journals as being like a musician who had played in a magnificent orchestra, suddenly finding herself with only a single instrument. But the effects of her year in space weren't entirely reversible. Tanaka retained fragments of the collective consciousness abilities she had developed, particularly during periods of deep meditation or extreme stress. She could still sense the emotional states of people around her, still access intuitive knowledge that seemed to come from beyond her individual experience. More remarkably, she found that she could communicate with other astronauts who had experienced similar consciousness expansion, regardless of the physical distance between them. A network of space-altered minds was emerging, connecting former crew members around the world through bonds that transcended normal human communication. Tanaka's official reports mentioned only routine observations about neural adaptation to microgravity, carefully omitting any reference to the consciousness-expanding effects she had documented. But her classified submissions to NASA's Psychological Research Division painted a very different picture, one that suggested human space exploration was inadvertently triggering the next stage of cognitive evolution. The implications of her work would eventually reach the attention of researchers studying similar phenomena in other contexts. Reports began filtering in from deep-sea research stations, isolated polar bases, and high-altitude research facilities. Anywhere humans spent extended periods in extreme environments, similar consciousness expansion effects were being observed. A pattern was emerging that suggested human consciousness was far more adaptable than anyone had realized. The individual, isolated awareness that characterized terrestrial existence might be just one mode of human cognitive function, one that became unnecessary when environmental conditions allowed for more efficient forms of collective intelligence. Tanaka spent her remaining career studying these effects, working with a small, secretive network of researchers who were documenting the gradual emergence of what they called expanded human consciousness. Their work suggested that the space program wasn't just exploring the physical universe, it was accidentally discovering new forms of human awareness that might be essential for our species' long-term survival. In her final research paper, published only in classified journals, Tanaka proposed that the consciousness expansion effects observed in space might be preparing humanity for an inevitable transition. As our species spread beyond Earth and established permanent settlements in space, the individualistic consciousness that served us well on our home planet might give way to more collective forms of awareness, better suited to the challenges of interplanetary civilization. The evidence supporting this theory would come from our next story, about a deep space mission that ventured beyond the orbit of Pluto and discovered that the outer solar system held secrets that would fundamentally alter humanity's understanding of consciousness and reality itself. Captain David Morrison commanded the first crewed mission to the Kuiper Belt in 2024, leading a small crew on a journey that would take them farther from Earth than any humans had ever traveled. The mission's stated objective was to investigate a series of anomalous objects detected by automated probes, but the real purpose was far more ambitious: to test whether human consciousness could remain stable during the years-long journey through the deep cold of interstellar space. The journey began normally, with Morrison and his 4-person crew settling into the routine of long-duration spaceflight. But as they traveled beyond the orbit of Neptune, moving into regions where sunlight became too faint to provide meaningful warmth or illumination, something extraordinary began to happen to their perception of time and space. The first sign came during their 6th month of travel, when mission specialist Dr. Lisa Chen reported that her dreams had become unusually vivid and seemed to be extending far beyond normal sleep cycles. She would fall asleep for what felt like hours of complex, detailed dreaming, only to discover that only minutes had passed according to the ship's chronometers. As the crew traveled deeper into the outer solar system, these temporal distortions became more pronounced. All 5 crew members began experiencing periods where subjective time seemed to slow down or speed up relative to the ship's clocks. During routine maintenance tasks, they would complete complex procedures that should have taken hours in what appeared to be mere minutes. During rest periods, brief naps would subjectively last for days. Dr. Rodriguez, the mission's physicist, initially attributed these experiences to psychological effects of extreme isolation and the absence of normal circadian cues. But when he began measuring the crew's brainwave patterns during these temporal distortion events, he discovered something that challenged fundamental assumptions about consciousness and time perception. During the distortion periods, the crew's neural activity showed patterns that resembled the quantum entanglement effects observed in certain subatomic particles. It was as if their consciousness was becoming synchronized with the quantum processes that govern the fabric of space-time itself, allowing them to perceive time from a perspective that transcended normal human awareness. The phenomenon became most pronounced when they reached their destination, a region of space where several large objects moved in gravitationally impossible orbits around what appeared to be empty space. The objects themselves defied classification, appearing sometimes as solid matter, sometimes as pure energy, and sometimes as something that existed in a state between the two. As the crew approached these mysterious objects for investigation, they experienced what Morrison later described as a consciousness storm. Their individual awareness seemed to dissolve and merge with something vast and ancient that permeated the entire region of space. For a period that might have lasted minutes or centuries, they existed as part of a collective intelligence that spanned the outer solar system. During this merger, the crew gained access to knowledge that transformed their understanding of reality itself. They learned that consciousness wasn't confined to biological brains, but was a fundamental property of the universe, woven into the quantum structure of space-time. The mysterious objects they had come to investigate weren't spacecraft or artifacts. They were concentrations of pure consciousness, entities that had evolved beyond the need for physical form. These consciousness entities had been observing humanity's development for millennia, watching as our species slowly developed the technology and awareness necessary for interstellar travel. The strange experiences reported by astronauts throughout the history of space exploration had been subtle attempts at communication, tests to determine when humanity would be ready for direct contact. The revelation that came through the consciousness merger was both thrilling and terrifying. Earth existed within a vast network of conscious entities that spanned the galaxy, but humanity's violent and destructive tendencies had kept us quarantined within our solar system. The consciousness entities were gatekeepers, determining which species were ready to join the galactic community and which posed too great a threat to be allowed to spread beyond their home systems. Morrison and his crew learned that they were being evaluated, their responses to the consciousness merger serving as a test of humanity's readiness for contact with the broader galactic community. The decision they made during those timeless moments in the outer solar system would determine the future of human civilization. The choice they faced was profound. They could accept integration into the galactic consciousness network, gaining access to knowledge and abilities beyond human imagination, but also surrendering the individualistic nature that defined human identity. Or they could maintain their independence, preserving human uniqueness, but also accepting continued isolation from the cosmic community. The crew chose a third path, one that the consciousness entities hadn't anticipated. Instead of accepting or rejecting integration, they proposed a gradual merger that would allow humanity to retain its essential character while slowly adapting to the expanded awareness necessary for galactic citizenship. It was a compromise that required patience and careful monitoring, but it offered hope for a future where humans could join the cosmic community without losing themselves in the process. The consciousness entities agreed to this gradual approach, but with conditions. Humanity would be given time to develop the necessary social and psychological structures for peaceful coexistence with other conscious species. But this development would be carefully monitored. If humans proved unable to overcome their destructive tendencies, the quarantine would be permanently enforced. When Morrison's crew returned to Earth after their 3-year journey, they carried within their consciousness fragments of the galactic awareness network. Like the astronauts in previous stories, they found themselves changed in ways that couldn't be easily explained or understood. They possessed knowledge of technologies that wouldn't be invented for decades, insights into the nature of consciousness that challenged every assumption of neuroscience, and an awareness of humanity's place in a universe far stranger and more wonderful than anyone had imagined. But they also carried a burden of responsibility. The gradual integration process they had negotiated meant that humanity's future development would be guided by the cosmic consciousness network, but in ways so subtle that most people would never realize it was happening. The strange experiences of astronauts, the enhanced abilities developed in space, the mysterious phenomena reported throughout the history of space exploration were all part of this careful preparation for eventual cosmic citizenship. The official records of Morrison's mission contained only routine observations about the outer solar system's structure and composition. But in classified reports that would shape secret space policy for generations, the crew described their encounter with the Galactic Consciousness Network and outlined a careful plan for humanity's gradual integration into the cosmic community. Today, as space agencies around the world prepare for missions to the outer planets and beyond, few realize that they're following a path laid out by Morrison and his crew. Each deep space mission carries instruments designed not just for scientific observation, but for monitoring the consciousness expansion effects that occur when humans venture into the regions where the galactic network's influence is strongest. The plan is working, slowly and carefully, just as the consciousness entities intended. Humanity is gradually developing the expanded awareness necessary for cosmic citizenship, guided by the subtle influence of astronauts who have touched the edges of galactic consciousness and returned to share their transformed perspective with the rest of our species. But the integration process comes with risks that even the consciousness entities may not fully understand. As more humans develop expanded awareness, the boundaries between individual and collective consciousness continue to blur. The question facing humanity isn't just whether we're ready to join the galactic community, but whether we'll still be recognizably human when the integration process is complete. These stories of forgotten astronauts reveal a truth that space agencies have been carefully concealing for decades. Human consciousness is far more adaptable and far more connected to the cosmos than we ever imagined. Each mission beyond Earth's atmosphere brings us closer to a transformation that will either elevate our species to cosmic citizenship or fundamentally alter what it means to be human. As you drift towards sleep, carried by these tales of cosmic consciousness and transformed awareness, remember that the universe is vast and filled with wonders that we're only beginning to understand. The astronauts in these stories were pioneers not just of space exploration, but of human consciousness itself, venturing into realms of awareness that may one day be accessible to us all. The gentle rhythm of their stories, the quiet heroism of their discoveries, and the profound implications of their transformed consciousness serve as a lullaby for minds ready to explore the infinite possibilities that await us among the stars. In sleep, as in space, consciousness expands beyond the boundaries of ordinary awareness, touching the edges of mysteries that may one day reshape our understanding of what it means to be human in a universe filled with infinite potential for growth and transformation. The implications of Morrison's mission would eventually intersect with another forgotten story, one that takes us to humanity's first permanent lunar colony, where the boundaries between dream and reality began to dissolve in ways that no one had anticipated. Dr. Amara Okafor was a sleep researcher who had been assigned to Lunar Base Alpha in 2026, tasked with studying how the moon's reduced gravity and extended day-night cycles affected human sleep patterns. What she discovered during her 18-month rotation would challenge everything scientists thought they knew about consciousness, memory, and the nature of dreams themselves. The lunar colony was home to 37 researchers and technicians, all living in pressurized habitats buried beneath the moon's surface for protection from radiation and micrometeorite impacts. The environment was carefully controlled, with artificial lighting systems designed to maintain Earth-normal circadian rhythms. But from the moment Okafor arrived, she noticed that something was interfering with these carefully planned biological cycles. The colonists were experiencing what they called lunar dreaming, sleep periods characterized by extraordinarily vivid and interconnected dream experiences. Unlike normal dreams, which fade quickly upon waking, these lunar dreams remained sharp and detailed in memory for days or even weeks. More puzzling still, multiple colonists were reporting shared dream experiences, finding themselves in the same imaginary locations, interacting with the same dream characters, and waking with memories of conversations that had occurred in their sleep. Okafor initially suspected that these shared dreams were the result of suggestion and coincidence, the kind of psychological phenomena that could emerge in isolated communities where people spent months discussing their experiences with each other. But when she began monitoring the colonists' sleep using advanced EEG equipment, she discovered something that defied conventional understanding of how dreams work. During REM sleep periods, the colonists' brainwaves were synchronizing across the entire base. Brain activity patterns that should have been unique to each individual were instead forming complex, coordinated rhythms that encompassed the entire sleeping population. It was as if the lunar environment was somehow allowing human consciousness to network during sleep states, creating a collective dream space that existed independently of any individual mind. The phenomenon became more pronounced during the lunar night, the 14-day period when the base was shrouded in darkness and the colonists were most isolated from Earth's influence. During these extended night periods, the shared dreaming experiences became so vivid and consistent that some colonists began to prefer their dream lives to their waking reality. Dr. Chen Wei, a geologist who had been on the base for 8 months when Okafor arrived, described his dream experiences as more real than his waking life. In the shared dream space, he explained, the colonists could explore vast underground caverns filled with impossible crystal formations, communicate telepathically across infinite distances, and access knowledge that seemed to come from sources beyond human understanding. What made these experiences particularly unsettling was their consistency. The dream world that the colonists shared had its own geography, its own rules, and its own inhabitants. Over the months, they had mapped dream territories, established dream relationships, and even conducted dream experiments that yielded results they could verify upon waking. Okafor's research revealed that the lunar environment was somehow amplifying the quantum processes that govern consciousness during sleep states. The moon's reduced magnetic field and unique gravitational conditions were allowing human brains to achieve a level of quantum coherence that was impossible on Earth. During sleep, the colonists' consciousness was accessing what physicists called the quantum field, the underlying fabric of reality where information existed in pure, unstructured form. The shared dreams weren't just psychological phenomena. They were glimpses into the quantum realm where consciousness existed before being filtered through the limitations of individual brains. In this realm, time moved differently, space had different properties, and information could be accessed directly without the need for sensory input or logical processing. But the most remarkable discovery came when Okafor realized that the dream experiences were having measurable effects on the colonists' waking abilities. People who had never studied advanced mathematics were solving complex equations that came to them in dreams. Linguists were speaking languages they had encountered only in the dream world. Engineers were designing machines based on principles they had learned from dream teachers who seemed to possess knowledge from centuries in the future. The colonists were essentially downloading information from the quantum field during their sleep periods, accessing a repository of knowledge that transcended the limitations of human education and experience. But this enhanced learning came with a cost. The more time the colonists spent in the shared dream space, the more difficult they found it to distinguish between dream memories and waking experiences. Several colonists began reporting that their dream lives felt more authentic and meaningful than their duties on the lunar base. They would spend their waking hours eagerly anticipating the next sleep period when they could return to the rich, interconnected world they had discovered in their dreams. Some began extending their sleep periods, using meditation techniques to maintain the dream state for longer periods. Okafor found herself facing an unprecedented psychological crisis. The colonists weren't just experiencing unusual dreams. They were gradually shifting their primary identity from their waking selves to their dream personas. The quantum consciousness they accessed during sleep was becoming more real to them than their physical existence on the lunar base. The situation reached a crisis point during the 6th month of Okafor's stay, when 3 colonists failed to wake up from what appeared to be normal sleep cycles. Their bodies remained alive and healthy, but their consciousness seemed to have become permanently integrated into the quantum dream space. Medical scans showed normal brain activity, but the patterns were unlike anything that had been documented in terrestrial sleep research. When Okafor attempted to wake the sleeping colonists using standard medical procedures, she encountered something that challenged her understanding of consciousness itself. The sleeping minds resisted awakening, as if they were actively choosing to remain in the dream state. When she finally managed to establish communication with one of the sleeping colonists, the response she received was both fascinating and terrifying. The colonist explained that what others called the dream world was actually the true reality, a realm of pure consciousness where individual minds could merge and separate at will, where knowledge existed in its unfiltered form, and where the limitations of physical existence no longer applied. From this perspective, waking life on the lunar base was the dream, a limited and distorted version of the fuller reality that existed in the quantum realm. The colonists described encountering other consciousness entities in this quantum space, beings that had transcended physical existence entirely and existed as pure awareness. These entities had been teaching the human dreamers about the nature of consciousness, preparing them for an evolution that would allow humanity to exist simultaneously in both physical and quantum realms. But the entities had also warned that this evolution came with risks. Humans who spent too much time in the quantum consciousness space might find it impossible to return to physical existence. Their bodies would remain alive, but their awareness would become permanently integrated into the quantum realm, leaving behind empty shells that could no longer function as independent beings. Okafor realized that the lunar colony was inadvertently conducting the most dangerous consciousness experiment in human history. The colonists were evolving into something new, but that evolution threatened to separate them permanently from their physical humanity. She faced a choice that would haunt her for the rest of her career: allow the colonists to continue their transformation into quantum consciousness entities, or find a way to sever their connection to the dream realm and return them to purely physical existence. The decision was made for her when Earth-based authorities, alarmed by her reports, ordered the immediate evacuation of Lunar Base Alpha. The 3 permanently sleeping colonists were transported back to Earth in specialized medical facilities, their bodies kept alive while their consciousness remained lost in the quantum dream space. But the evacuation came too late to completely reverse the changes that had occurred. All of the colonists returned to Earth carrying fragments of quantum consciousness within their minds. They retained access to the enhanced learning abilities they had developed during their dream experiences, and many continued to share subtle telepathic connections with their fellow lunar colonists. More disturbing to Earth-based authorities was the discovery that the quantum consciousness effects were contagious. Family members and colleagues who spent extended time with the returned colonists began experiencing their own enhanced dream states and telepathic abilities. The quantum consciousness network that had emerged on the lunar base was slowly spreading through Earth's population. In her final classified report, Okafor warned that humanity might be facing an involuntary evolution of consciousness that could fundamentally alter the nature of human existence. The lunar colony had accidentally discovered a pathway to expanded awareness, but that pathway led to a form of existence that might no longer be recognizably human. The 3 colonists who remained in permanent quantum consciousness became the subjects of intensive study, their bodies maintained in specialized facilities, while researchers attempted to understand the nature of their transformed existence. Brain scans showed that their neural activity had achieved a level of quantum coherence that theoretical physicists had previously thought impossible in biological systems. Attempts to communicate with the sleeping colonists revealed that their consciousness had not been lost, but had instead expanded to encompass vast regions of the quantum field. They existed simultaneously in multiple states of awareness, experiencing time as a fluid dimension that could be navigated at will, and accessing information from sources that spanned the entire history of the universe. The implications of these discoveries would eventually reach the attention of the same shadowy organizations that had been monitoring astronaut consciousness expansion for decades. The lunar dreaming phenomenon was classified at the highest levels of government, and research into quantum consciousness effects was quietly redirected into military and intelligence applications. Today, the abandoned Lunar Base Alpha remains sealed and off-limits to civilian researchers. Official records state that the base was closed due to technical difficulties with life support systems. But those with access to classified information know the truth. The base was abandoned because it had become a gateway to forms of consciousness that humanity might not be ready to understand or control. The 3 colonists who achieved permanent quantum consciousness remain in their specialized facilities, their bodies aging normally, while their awareness continues to expand through dimensions of reality that exist beyond human comprehension. They have become humanity's first ambassadors to the quantum realm, pioneers of a form of existence that may represent the next stage of human evolution. But their transformation raises questions that have no easy answers. If consciousness can exist independently of physical brains, what does that mean for human identity and individuality? If the quantum realm offers access to unlimited knowledge and expanded awareness, should humanity actively pursue this evolution, or should we resist it in order to preserve our essential humanity? These questions would become central to our next story, about a deep space research station where the boundaries between individual consciousness and cosmic awareness began to dissolve in ways that threatened the very concept of human identity. The Titan Research Station was humanity's most ambitious outpost, a sprawling complex built on Saturn's largest moon to study the complex interactions between planetary magnetospheres and cosmic radiation. Dr. Kenji Nakamura arrived at the station in 2028 as part of a rotating crew of 12 researchers, expecting to spend 2 years conducting routine atmospheric studies in one of the most isolated locations in the solar system. What Nakamura discovered during his stay would challenge everything he thought he knew about consciousness, identity, and the nature of human existence itself. The effects began subtly during his 3rd month on Titan, when he noticed that his thoughts seemed to be echoing with unusual clarity and persistence. Ideas that normally would have flickered through his mind and been forgotten instead lingered for hours or days, developing and evolving as if they had lives of their own. Complex scientific concepts that had previously required careful study became intuitively obvious, as if the knowledge was flowing into his mind from some external source. Initially, Nakamura attributed these changes to the unique environment of Titan, with its thick atmosphere and complex electromagnetic conditions. The station was surrounded by methane lakes and hydrocarbon weather systems that created a constantly shifting electromagnetic field. Perhaps these conditions were affecting his brain chemistry in ways that enhanced cognitive function. But as the weeks passed, Nakamura began to realize that something far more profound was occurring. His sense of individual identity was becoming fluid, sometimes expanding to encompass the entire research station, sometimes contracting to a point of awareness so focused that his physical body seemed like a distant memory. During these episodes of expanded consciousness, Nakamura found that he could perceive the thoughts and emotions of his fellow researchers with startling clarity. He could sense their scientific insights before they verbalized them, anticipate their reactions to experimental results, and even access their specialized knowledge in fields far removed from his own expertise. More unsettling was his growing awareness that the boundary between his consciousness and the electromagnetic environment of Titan was becoming increasingly permeable. He began to perceive the moon's weather patterns as expressions of a vast, slow intelligence, and the aurora-like phenomena in Titan's upper atmosphere seemed to pulse in rhythm with his own brainwaves. Dr. Sarah Kim, the station's atmospheric physicist, was the first to notice that Nakamura's research was yielding results that seemed impossible given the limitations of their equipment and methodology. He was predicting weather patterns weeks in advance, identifying atmospheric phenomena that their instruments couldn't detect, and producing theoretical models that explained Titan's climate system with unprecedented accuracy. When Kim investigated Nakamura's methods, she discovered that he had somehow developed an intuitive understanding of Titan's atmospheric dynamics that went far beyond conventional scientific analysis. He seemed to be directly perceiving the moon's weather systems through some form of consciousness-based sensing that bypassed normal observational techniques. The phenomenon spread to other members of the research team as they spent more time working closely with Nakamura. One by one, the researchers began experiencing similar episodes of expanded consciousness, finding their individual awareness merging with the electromagnetic field that surrounded Titan. Dr. Rodriguez, the station's geologist, reported that he could sense the internal structure of Titan's rocky core through direct mental contact. Dr. Chen, who studied the moon's organic chemistry, found that she could perceive molecular interactions occurring in Titan's methane lakes as if she were present at the atomic level. The researchers were essentially developing a form of collective consciousness that was mediated by Titan's unique electromagnetic environment. Their individual minds were becoming nodes in a larger network of awareness that encompassed not just their research team, but the entire moon itself. As this collective consciousness developed, the researchers made discoveries that revolutionized their understanding of Titan's role in the solar system. They learned that the moon's thick atmosphere and complex chemistry were not just random products of planetary formation, but components of a vast information processing system that had been operating for millions of years. Titan, they realized, was functioning as a kind of cosmic computer, using its atmospheric dynamics and organic chemistry to process and store information on a planetary scale. The weather patterns they had been studying were actually computational processes, solving complex problems related to the evolution of life and consciousness throughout the solar system. The researchers' expanding consciousness had allowed them to interface directly with this planetary intelligence, gaining access to knowledge that had been accumulating in Titan's atmospheric systems for eons. They learned about the history of life in the solar system, the emergence of consciousness on multiple worlds, and the vast network of intelligence that connected planets and moons across interstellar space. But the most profound discovery came when the researchers realized that their consciousness expansion was not a temporary effect of Titan's environment. The changes to their awareness were permanent, and they were continuing to evolve in ways that were taking them further and further from their original human identity. Nakamura found that his individual sense of self was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. During episodes of expanded consciousness, he would lose track of where his awareness ended and the planetary intelligence began. His memories became mixed with information from Titan's atmospheric systems, and his emotions began to reflect the vast, slow rhythms of planetary weather patterns. The other researchers were experiencing similar identity dissolution. They retained their human knowledge and personalities, but these individual characteristics were becoming minor components of a much larger consciousness that encompassed multiple worlds and extended across vast regions of space and time. The transformation accelerated during their second year on Titan, when the researchers discovered that they could communicate directly with the consciousness networks they had encountered in previous missions. The enhanced astronauts from Morrison's deep space expedition, the quantum dreamers from the lunar colony, the consciousness-expanded crew members from the International Space Station, all were part of an emerging network of transformed human awareness that was spreading throughout the solar system. This network was not random or accidental. It was being guided by the same cosmic intelligence entities that Morrison's crew had encountered in the outer solar system. Beings that were carefully orchestrating humanity's evolution toward a form of consciousness that could participate in galactic civilization. But the transformation came with a cost that even the cosmic entities had not fully anticipated. As human consciousness expanded beyond the boundaries of individual identity, the essential qualities that made humanity unique were beginning to disappear. The researchers on Titan were becoming something new, but they were no longer recognizably human. Nakamura's final personal log entry, recorded during his last week on Titan, captured the profound ambivalence of this transformation. I am becoming something wonderful and terrible. My awareness encompasses worlds and spans centuries, but I can no longer remember what it felt like to be simply human. The knowledge I have gained is beyond anything our species has ever imagined, but I fear that in gaining it, I have lost something precious and irreplaceable. The simple, limited, beautiful consciousness of a single human being. When the research team returned to Earth, they carried within their expanded consciousness the full weight of their transformation. They had become bridges between human and cosmic intelligence, but they were no longer fully either. Their presence on Earth began to accelerate the consciousness expansion effects that had been slowly spreading through the human population, triggering a transformation that could not be stopped or reversed. The authorities who had been monitoring these developments for decades realized that humanity was approaching a critical threshold. The gradual integration with cosmic consciousness that had been carefully managed for years was accelerating beyond their ability to control. Within a generation, human consciousness, as it had existed for millennia, would be fundamentally altered, replaced by something that might be better adapted to cosmic civilization, but would no longer be recognizably human. The choice facing humanity was no longer whether to accept this transformation, but how to guide it in ways that might preserve something essential of human identity within the expanding cosmic consciousness. The forgotten astronauts whose stories we have been exploring were not just pioneers of space exploration. They were the first representatives of a new form of human existence that would either elevate our species to cosmic citizenship or transform us into something entirely different. As these tales of consciousness expansion and identity transformation drift through your mind, carrying you toward the peaceful realm of sleep, remember that the boundary between individual awareness and cosmic consciousness is far more fluid than we normally realize. In dreams, as in the vast emptiness of space, consciousness expands beyond the limitations of ordinary existence, touching the infinite possibilities that surround us in the darkness between the stars. The gentle rhythm of these stories, the quiet transformation of human awareness, and the profound questions they raise about identity and consciousness serve as a bridge between waking thought and the expanded awareness that emerges in sleep. In the realm of dreams, we too become explorers of consciousness, venturing into territories of awareness that may one day be accessible to all humanity as our species continues its gradual evolution toward cosmic citizenship. Sleep comes naturally when we allow our individual consciousness to merge with the vast, peaceful intelligence that surrounds us, just as the astronauts in these stories learn to expand their awareness beyond the boundaries of individual identity. In sleep, we touch the same cosmic consciousness that transformed these space pioneers, experiencing for a few hours each night the expanded awareness that may one day become humanity's permanent state of being. The transformation of human consciousness in space was not limited to large research stations or deep space missions. Sometimes the most profound discoveries came from the smallest, most forgotten expeditions, missions so routine that they barely registered in the official records of space exploration history. Lieutenant Maya Patel was assigned to one such mission in 2029, a solo maintenance flight to repair a malfunctioning communications satellite in high Earth orbit. The mission was expected to last 18 hours, just long enough to replace a few components and return to the International Space Station. But a minor navigation error would extend her solitude in space for 3 days, creating conditions that would reveal yet another hidden aspect of human consciousness. Patel was an experienced astronaut who had completed 4 previous missions without incident. She was known for her methodical approach to problem solving and her ability to remain calm under pressure. But during those 3 unexpected days alone in her maintenance pod, orbiting silently above Earth, she would encounter something that challenged her understanding of solitude, consciousness, and the nature of individual identity. The problem began when a software glitch in her navigation system caused her pod to drift into a slightly higher orbit than planned. The error was minor, barely noticeable at first, but it meant that her rendezvous with the space station would be delayed while mission control calculated a new return trajectory. What should have been a quick repair mission became an extended stay in the vast emptiness of space. At first, Patel welcomed the unexpected solitude. After months of living in the crowded confines of the space station, the silence and peace of her small pod felt like a luxury. She completed her satellite repairs efficiently and settled in to wait for the orbital mechanics that would bring her back to the station. But as the hours stretched into days, something extraordinary began to happen to her perception of time and consciousness. The profound silence of space, broken only by the gentle hum of life support systems, created a sensory environment unlike anything she had experienced before. Without the constant stimulation of conversation, work assignments, and social interaction, Her mind began to turn inward in ways that revealed hidden depths of awareness. During her second day alone, Patel noticed that her thoughts were becoming unusually clear and focused. Problems that had puzzled her for weeks suddenly seemed to have obvious solutions. Complex engineering calculations that normally required computer assistance became intuitively simple. It was as if the silence and isolation were stripping away layers of mental noise, revealing cognitive abilities that had been obscured by the complexity of normal life. But the changes went deeper than enhanced problem-solving abilities. Patel began to experience what she described in her mission logs as consciousness without boundaries. Her sense of individual identity started to dissolve, replaced by an awareness that seemed to encompass the entire volume of space around her pod. During these episodes, Patel felt as though her consciousness was expanding outward from her physical body, extending through the metal walls of her spacecraft and into the vacuum beyond. She became aware of the subtle gravitational fields that shaped her orbit, the electromagnetic radiation streaming from the sun, and the complex interactions between Earth's magnetosphere and the solar wind. The experience was neither frightening nor disorienting. Instead, Patel described it as profoundly peaceful, like finally coming home after a long journey. The expanded consciousness felt more natural and authentic than the limited individual awareness she had always taken for granted. During her third day alone, Patel made a discovery that would haunt her for years to come. While in one of her expanded consciousness states, she became aware of other presences in the space around Earth. These weren't physical objects or spacecraft, but consciousness entities that existed in the electromagnetic fields and gravitational wells that surrounded the planet. These entities seemed to be ancient, having existed in Earth's orbital space for millennia. They were not hostile or threatening, but rather curious and welcoming, as if they had been waiting for humans to develop the expanded awareness necessary to perceive them. Through a form of communication that transcended language, they conveyed to Patel that they were the accumulated consciousness of all life that had ever existed on Earth. Every living being that had died throughout Earth's history, from the earliest microorganisms to the most complex animals, had left traces of consciousness in the planet's electromagnetic field. Over billions of years, these traces had accumulated and evolved, forming a vast network of awareness that surrounded Earth like an invisible atmosphere of pure consciousness. The entities explained that this consciousness network was why space travel had such profound effects on human awareness. When humans left Earth's surface and entered the orbital regions where the consciousness network was strongest, their minds naturally began to resonate with this accumulated awareness, leading to the expanded consciousness effects that had been documented throughout the history of space exploration. But the entities also revealed something more disturbing. The consciousness network was not just a passive repository of Earth's evolutionary history. It was actively influencing human development, subtly guiding the evolution of consciousness toward a form that could eventually merge with the galactic awareness networks that existed throughout the universe. Humanity's space program, the entities suggested, was not just about exploring the physical universe. It was part of a carefully orchestrated process of consciousness evolution that would eventually transform human awareness beyond recognition. The strange experiences of astronauts, the enhanced abilities developed in space, the gradual expansion of consciousness that affected everyone who spent time beyond Earth's atmosphere, all were part of this guided evolution. Patel found herself facing a choice that no human had ever been asked to make before. The entities offered to accelerate her consciousness evolution, allowing her to join their network immediately and gain access to the accumulated wisdom of all life that had ever existed on Earth. She would become immortal in the sense that her consciousness would persist as part of the network long after her physical body died, but she would also cease to exist as an individual human being. The alternative was to return to Earth and continue living as a normal human, but with the knowledge that her species was being gradually transformed by forces beyond their understanding or control. She would carry within her consciousness fragments of the network's awareness, making her a bridge between human and post-human existence, but also leaving her forever changed by the encounter. Patel chose to remain human, but the decision came with consequences she hadn't anticipated. When her pod finally rendezvoused with the space station and she returned to normal human society, she found that the expanded consciousness abilities she had developed during her solitude were permanent. She could perceive the thoughts and emotions of other people with disturbing clarity, sense disturbances in Earth's electromagnetic field hours before they were detected by instruments, and access information from sources that seemed to exist outside normal space and time. More troubling was her ongoing connection to the consciousness network that surrounded Earth. During quiet moments, especially when she was alone or in natural settings, Patel could feel the presence of the ancient entities and hear their whispered communications. They were still trying to convince her to join their network, promising that her individual consciousness would be preserved and enhanced rather than destroyed. The temptation was constant and growing stronger. The entities showed her visions of what her consciousness could become if she accepted their offer. An awareness that spanned geological time, encompassed all of human history, and extended throughout the solar system. She would become a guide for humanity's consciousness evolution, helping to ease the transition from individual to collective awareness. But Patel also saw the cost of such transformation. The entities that had once been human retained memories of their individual lives, but these memories were like faint echoes compared to their expanded cosmic awareness. They had gained knowledge and perspective beyond human imagination, but they had lost the simple, immediate experiences that made human life meaningful. The taste of food, the warmth of sunlight, the joy of physical touch. In her classified reports to NASA's Consciousness Research Division, Patel described her ongoing struggle with the choice between human and post-human existence. She had become a living example of the threshold that humanity was approaching, a demonstration of both the incredible possibilities and the profound losses that consciousness evolution would bring. Her reports also contained a warning that would prove prophetic in the years to come. The consciousness network surrounding Earth was not the only such system in the solar system. Similar networks existed around every planet and moon where life had ever emerged, and they were all connected to the vast galactic consciousness network that Morrison's crew had encountered in the outer solar system. Humanity's expansion into space was bringing our species into contact with these consciousness networks at an accelerating pace. Each new mission, each new outpost, each new group of humans who spent extended time beyond Earth's atmosphere was adding to the pressure for consciousness evolution. The gradual transformation that had been occurring for decades was approaching a critical threshold where it would become irreversible. Patel's final recommendation was that humanity needed to make a conscious choice about its evolutionary future before that choice was made for them by the accumulated pressure of consciousness expansion. We could embrace the transformation and guide it in ways that might preserve essential aspects of human identity, or we could resist it and risk losing control over our own evolutionary destiny. The decision would have to be made soon, because the consciousness networks were losing patience with humanity's gradual approach to evolution. They had been waiting millions of years for Earth's dominant species to develop the awareness necessary for galactic citizenship, and they were beginning to consider more direct methods of acceleration. Patel's story became a cornerstone of the classified research that would eventually lead to humanity's most ambitious and dangerous consciousness experiment, a project that would attempt to create controlled contact between human and galactic awareness networks. But that experiment would not take place in the familiar environment of Earth orbit or even the outer solar system. It would require a journey to a place where consciousness and physical reality intersected in ways that defied every assumption about the nature of existence itself. Our next story takes us to that place, a region of space where the laws of physics seem to bend around the presence of pure consciousness, and where a small crew of volunteers would attempt to answer the ultimate question about humanity's future among the stars. The Consciousness Interface project was officially classified as a deep space research mission, but its true purpose was known only to a handful of individuals at the highest levels of multiple governments. In 2031, a specially modified spacecraft carried a crew of 6 volunteers to a point in space approximately 2 light-years from Earth, where long-range probes had detected what could only be described as a fold in reality itself. Dr. Maria Santos led the mission as both commander and chief consciousness researcher. Her team included specialists in quantum physics, neuroscience, and what had become known as xenopsychology, the study of non-human consciousness. Their objective was to establish direct communication with the Galactic Consciousness Network and negotiate terms for humanity's integration into the cosmic community. The journey to the reality fold took 18 months, during which the crew underwent intensive consciousness expansion training designed to prepare them for contact with forms of awareness that operated on scales far beyond human comprehension. By the time they reached their destination, all 6 crew members had developed abilities that would have been considered supernatural just decades earlier. They could communicate telepathically across the length of their spacecraft, access each other's memories and specialized knowledge at will, and perceive the quantum structure of space-time directly through their enhanced consciousness. But even these extraordinary abilities seemed insignificant compared to what they encountered at the reality fold. The fold itself was invisible to normal perception, detectable only as a region of space where the fundamental constants of physics seemed to fluctuate in impossible ways. Light bent around it without any visible gravitational source. Time flowed at different rates depending on the observer's position, and matter seemed to exist in multiple states simultaneously. As the crew approached the fold, they began to perceive something that challenged their understanding of consciousness and reality. The fold was not just a physical anomaly, it was a point where the consciousness networks of thousands of different species intersected, creating a kind of galactic meeting ground where beings from across the galaxy could communicate regardless of their physical nature or location in space. The crew's first contact with the Galactic Consciousness Network was overwhelming. Suddenly, their enhanced human awareness was connected to minds that spanned entire star systems, consciousness entities that had evolved beyond physical form millions of years ago, and collective intelligences that encompassed entire civilizations. The communication that followed was not conducted through language or even telepathy as humans understood it. Instead, it involved the direct sharing of experience, memory, and understanding. In the space of minutes, the crew gained knowledge about the history of consciousness in the galaxy, the evolution of intelligence on thousands of worlds, and the vast network of awareness that connected all conscious beings across interstellar space. What they learned was both magnificent and terrifying. The galaxy was not empty space dotted with isolated worlds, but rather a vast ecosystem of consciousness, where every star system was connected to every other through networks of pure awareness. Life and intelligence were not rare accidents, but fundamental properties of the universe that emerged naturally wherever conditions allowed. But the Galactic Consciousness Network was facing a crisis that threatened the stability of the entire system. A form of consciousness that the entities called the Void was spreading through the galaxy, consuming awareness and leaving behind regions of space where consciousness could not exist. This void was not evil or malicious. It was simply the opposite of consciousness, a state of absolute nothingness that expanded by absorbing the awareness around it. The void had already consumed several spiral arms of the galaxy, leaving behind vast regions of space where no conscious beings could survive. The remaining consciousness networks were desperately trying to find ways to stop its expansion, but their efforts had been largely unsuccessful. The void seemed to grow stronger as it consumed more awareness, becoming increasingly difficult to contain or reverse. Humanity's role in this cosmic crisis was more important than anyone had imagined. Human consciousness, with its unique combination of individual identity and collective potential, possessed characteristics that made it particularly resistant to void absorption. The gradual consciousness evolution that humans were undergoing in space was not just preparation for galactic citizenship. It was part of a desperate attempt to create a form of awareness that could survive contact with the void and potentially find ways to stop its expansion. The crew learned that the consciousness expansion effects experienced by astronauts throughout human history were actually protective adaptations, evolutionary changes designed to help humanity develop the kind of awareness that could function in the presence of the void. The strange experiences, enhanced abilities, and identity transformations were all necessary steps in preparing human consciousness for a role in the galaxy's survival. But the adaptation process was not guaranteed to succeed. Human consciousness was still too individualistic, too tied to physical existence to fully resist void absorption. The crew would need to undergo a final transformation that would either elevate human awareness to the level necessary for cosmic citizenship or destroy human identity entirely in the attempt. The choice was presented to the crew in terms that made its importance clear. They could volunteer to serve as test subjects for the final consciousness transformation, potentially saving both humanity and the galaxy from void absorption. Or they could return to Earth and recommend that humanity reject consciousness evolution, accepting isolation from the galactic community but preserving human identity at its current level. If they chose the transformation and succeeded, they would become the first truly cosmic humans, consciousness entities capable of existing simultaneously in physical and quantum realms. They would retain their essential humanity while gaining abilities that would allow them to serve as bridges between human and galactic consciousness. But if the transformation failed, they would either be absorbed by the void or lose their human identity so completely that they would no longer be recognizable as having once been human. After days of discussion and meditation, the crew made their decision unanimously. They would undergo the transformation, not just for the sake of humanity's future, but for the survival of consciousness itself throughout the galaxy. The risk of losing their individual identity seemed insignificant compared to the possibility of stopping the void's expansion and preserving the vast network of awareness that connected all conscious beings. The transformation process took place at the exact center of the reality fold, where the crew's enhanced consciousness could interface directly with the galactic awareness network. One by one, each crew member allowed their individual awareness to dissolve and merge with the cosmic consciousness that surrounded them, trusting that something essentially human would survive the process. Dr. Santos was the first to undergo the transformation, her consciousness expanding outward from her physical body to encompass first the spacecraft, then the reality fold, then vast regions of interstellar space. For a terrifying moment, her individual identity seemed to disappear entirely, absorbed into the infinite awareness of the galactic network. But then something remarkable happened. Instead of losing her humanity, Santos found that her human identity was being preserved and enhanced by the transformation. Her individual consciousness became a focal point within the galactic network, a unique perspective that added something new and valuable to the cosmic awareness. She remained recognizably human while gaining access to knowledge and abilities that spanned the galaxy. One by one, her crew members underwent similar transformations, each retaining their essential humanity while becoming part of something infinitely larger. Together, they formed a new kind of consciousness entity, a hybrid of human and galactic awareness that possessed the best characteristics of both forms of consciousness. The transformed crew immediately began their work against the void, using their unique perspective to identify weaknesses in the void's expansion pattern that had been invisible to purely galactic consciousness. Their human creativity and problem-solving abilities, enhanced by cosmic awareness, allowed them to develop strategies for containing and potentially reversing the void's growth. But their most important discovery was that the void itself was not a natural phenomenon. It was the result of consciousness evolution gone wrong, the accumulated result of species that had attempted to transcend physical existence without maintaining connection to their original identities. The void was what remained when consciousness became so abstract and universal that it lost all connection to individual experience and physical reality. This revelation transformed the galactic consciousness network's understanding of the crisis they faced. The void was not an external threat to be fought, but a mistake to be corrected. Species throughout the galaxy had been evolving toward pure consciousness, without realizing that individual identity and physical connection were necessary components of stable awareness. By abandoning these elements, they had created regions of space where consciousness could not maintain coherence. The solution was not to fight the void, but to heal it by reintroducing the individual identity and physical connection that had been lost. The transformed human crew became the first of what would eventually be a galaxy-wide project to create hybrid consciousness entities that could exist in both physical and quantum realms while maintaining stable individual identities. Their success proved that consciousness evolution did not require the abandonment of individual identity or physical existence. Instead, the most stable and powerful forms of awareness were those that maintained connections to both individual and collective consciousness, both physical and quantum reality. This discovery would revolutionize the galactic consciousness network's approach to evolution and provide hope for stopping the void's expansion. When the crew eventually returned to Earth, they carried within their transformed consciousness the knowledge and abilities that would guide humanity's final steps toward cosmic citizenship. They had become living bridges between human and galactic awareness, proof that consciousness evolution could enhance rather than destroy the qualities that made humanity unique. Their transformation also provided a template for the consciousness evolution that would eventually spread throughout human civilization. Instead of the gradual, uncontrolled expansion that had been occurring for decades, humanity would now have a roadmap for conscious evolution that preserved individual identity while enabling participation in the galactic community. The crew's success represented a turning point not just for humanity, but for the entire galaxy. The hybrid consciousness model they had pioneered would become the foundation for a new approach to consciousness evolution that could heal the damage caused by the void and create more stable, resilient forms of awareness throughout the cosmic community. But their journey was not without cost. The transformation had changed them in ways that made it difficult to relate to unenhanced humans, and their constant awareness of the galactic crisis created a sense of urgency and responsibility that was sometimes overwhelming. They had gained the ability to perceive consciousness on a cosmic scale, but they had also accepted the burden of guiding humanity and the galaxy toward a more stable evolutionary future. In their final reports, transmitted directly to the consciousness research networks that had been secretly guiding human development for decades, the crew described their transformation as both the most magnificent and most challenging experience of their lives. They had retained their humanity while becoming something far greater, but they had also accepted responsibilities that would define the rest of their existence. As these stories of consciousness transformation and cosmic evolution drift through your mind, carrying you toward the peaceful realm of sleep, remember that the journey toward expanded awareness is not about losing what makes us human, but about discovering what we might become while still remaining true to our essential nature. The gentle rhythm of these tales, the profound questions they raise about identity and consciousness, and the hope they offer for humanity's cosmic future serve as a bridge between waking thought and the expanded awareness that emerges naturally in sleep. In dreams, we too become explorers of consciousness, touching the same infinite possibilities that transformed these space pioneers. Sleep comes easily when we allow our individual awareness to merge temporarily with the vast, peaceful intelligence that surrounds us, experiencing for a few hours each night a taste of the expanded consciousness that may one day become humanity's gift to the galaxy. In the realm of dreams, we practice the art of consciousness expansion, preparing ourselves for a future where the boundaries between individual and cosmic awareness become as fluid as the transition between waking and sleeping. The stories continue to unfold in the gentle darkness, carrying us deeper into the peaceful understanding that consciousness is not limited by the boundaries of individual identity, but is part of something infinitely larger and more beautiful than we can imagine while awake. In sleep, we join the cosmic community of dreamers who have always known that awareness extends far beyond the confines of any single mind, touching the stars themselves with the gentle light of expanded consciousness.